thing, the golf course challenges, the teaching games for understanding or constraints-led learning, as some people will refer to it. Tell us a little bit more about why you like to take players on the golf course and create games. But, you know, I've seen you coach. These aren't just generic games. These are games that you sit down, you look at stats, or you speak with the player at length, and then you design, and you also get the player to help you design these. So explain that a little bit more.
Yeah, so you touched on a couple key points there. When it comes to game design, the basic level, you have to start with what's the goal of this? What do I want the student to take away from this challenge, this game, this on-course performance-related task? What do I want them to take away from it? The second point that you made, you have to involve the student in the game design. That's going to make them take more ownership over it. It's going to help increase their motivation to do it. And it's also going to help make sure that they understand how to do it. So involving the student is big. The third one, I prefer to base it on stats. If I do have a player that doesn't have a stats program, then it's, hopefully I've seen them play in a tournament and I can help them in that sense. If I haven't seen them play in a tournament, then it's going to come down to the interview, kind of like you said. So the constraint-led learning approach, to me, the way I've always thought of it is when you look at or think about the best soccer players in the world, you always think of Brazil. And when you look at why Brazilians are so good at soccer, you look at how they are brought into the game as juniors, and it's ultimately through futsal or indoor soccer, right? Which is on a indoor, in America, basketball court basically, but it's on a wood surface. The field is smaller, the goals are smaller, and so there's a lot of this kind of systematic chaos going on. People are just flying around at faster speeds than if you're out on grass. And the ball's smaller and all that. So the challenges of the game are actually higher at a younger level. So then when these kids get out onto a full-size field and are playing 11 on 11 with normal-sized goals, all of a sudden the game is perceived to be easier, right? So that's the idea behind kind of the on-course challenges is how can we make this, the golf course, more demanding, more challenging than the true tournament would be for this player. But ultimately I want them to take away these learnings from it.
So again, when we were doing the practical part of the certification, there was a number of coaches watching, and the game you built was for the specific needs of a guy trying to qualify for the web.com, someone who's capable of shooting 8, 9, 10 under par, a decent mini tour player. For the people tuning into the certification, or for even if we're fortunate enough to get some players who want to do our certification online, if we think to some of the high school players that you coach, just take us through one of your game designs. So think back to one of a member that can play, or a kid that's a decent player, but not as good as this guy who you worked with this morning, and just talk us through the process of what were they struggling with. You talked to them, you then designed the game, and then they went out on the golf course and played this game. Did you then change the rules? Did you keep the rules the same? Just talk us through the whole practical process, because unfortunately we couldn't have the camera out filming today,
right.
And that leads to a lot of editing. So try and take the people that are tuning into this certification on this player's journey.
Yeah, so this particular player has a tendency, bounce back percentage is a big stat that's talked about on any level. So bounce back, for anybody that doesn't know, is basically if you make bogey or worse, how many times do you bounce back with a par or better? So this player tends to basically, when the oil starts leaking, it starts gushing pretty quickly. So when this player makes a bogey or worse, then it just goes downhill. They don't have this ability or this resilience to kind of fight back necessarily. And it's a tendency that we've seen consistently in their tournament performance. So the game design is all geared towards helping this player develop strategies to bounce back or becoming more comfortable in those situations, because it's now kind of this predetermined thing in their mind where as soon as they make a bogey, they just have this this conception that they're going to make a bogey or worse on the next hole. So anytime this player, when they go out and play, we actually started them from the forward tees, from the red tees, just to bring the challenge point down a little bit, shorter golf course. And so anytime this player, the goal is to make it to the back tees, and anytime this player makes a bogey or worse, they have to move forward a tee box. And from that forward position, they now have to make a par or better to then move back to the tee box they were currently on. And if they fail to do so, they start the whole game over again back at the forward tee. So out here would be the red tees. So that was the idea behind the game design, was ultimately how do we create an environment for this player. And we're putting shorter clubs in his hand so he's hitting more wedges and stuff, but just to get him more comfortable in the situation of trying to make basically pars or better after an undesirable score.
So again, we're talking here more about the transference of the skill, dealing with adversity, dealing with stress, being in practice and having an outcome that is going to weigh psychologically on you, maybe fire off that stress response, and you have to start learning to inoculate that stress response. So we're really talking there about these games and being out on the course and these constraints really sort of helping inoculate the stress response and helping people transfer their range game to the course. The stuff that Matthew talked about in his interview and showed the people that were at the certification and fortunate enough to hear him speak is more about the retention side of movement. So if this student is doing okay at this game and then they come to you and say, hey, I'm struggling with the putter, and whether you have stats or not, you decide, okay, look, I want to put a constraint in around their putting. Would you completely change the game, or would you potentially just add it into that game?
Yeah, if it was the same student, you could just add it into the game. So you could say that every second putt is going to be drawn back putter length. So basically, second putts, typically with players who are good lag putters, they're going to be hitting it within, we'll say, 3 feet, depending on the distance of the putt. And so if they're going to drop back a putter length, so all of a sudden every putt for par par or bogey, hopefully not for worse, is going to be from about that 5 to 6, 7 foot range. Yeah. So you all of a sudden put a little bit more stress on. And this is, again, for a player who is looking to or is struggling with kind of that short makeable putt range. If it was somebody struggling with lag putting, then it might all of a sudden become a proximity-based thing. If you don't hit it within a certain proximity, then you move your ball to X distance.
Got you.
And you then putt from there.
Okay, awesome. So again, it really becomes clear that constraints-led learning or teaching games for understanding is really down to the individual. You're not just getting 4 junior golfers or 4 members, or you're not just taking your lesson on the course and say, hey, we're going to play 2-ball, worst ball. You're sitting down and you're building the rules or the constraints, as they like to say, of these games around their specific needs. So then desired behaviors and habits can emerge. Yeah. And if you look back to my online course, where we were fortunate enough to speak to Dr. Erickson, he talks about this total process and building mental representations. So a mental representation is an image in your mind of being successful. You have to go through the total process of a golf shot to build these mental representations and hold these successful images in your mind. Can you build them on the golf range?
Mental representations? True mental representations? No. I would say no, because if you're talking about the truest form of context, then you have to be on the golf course.
I agree.
You can simulate things to a certain extent on the driving range because it has to be done. Unfortunately, the driving range is a big part of this game, so we have to find ways to utilize it more effectively. But if you're talking about the truest form of a mental representation, then it would have to be experienced in the truest form of performance.
Because not only is your student failing and learning to inoculate the stress response, at some point he's going to gain some success. So then when he's on the golf course in tournament play, he's got these images in his mind that are going to change his self-efficacy, if you like. So Awesome. So it was great to.
Yeah, and
Wanna
I
add
have,
something?
yeah, I have one other point that we made while we were outside with everybody. We were talking about the game that I developed for a student, and he came here, spent a couple months with us, and we developed a game for him geared towards hopefully improving his strategy, right? His on-course strategy. And we actually found that wasn't what it did, right? And so that goes back to the importance of including the student in the game design. He was included in the design of the game, but he wasn't included in the intentions of the game. I didn't tell him what I wanted him to take away from it.
Yeah.
And so what I thought he'd take away from it versus what he actually took away from it were very different. And so it's important to note that and to understand that a game that I designed for you is going to be very, what you take away from it is going to be very different maybe than what Matthew would take away from the same game.
Yeah.
So the game design has to be, designed for the individual. And you have to include them in it because you need their feedback throughout the game to decide if you need to adjust it and adapt it over time. You don't oftentimes get it right the first time, and it does need to be adjusted. And as the player continues to become more successful, then it might be time to keep the game the same. Maybe you pull out some constraints, add in some new constraints, whatever the case might be. But the games are always kind of shaping and shifting and evolving over time. So it's just important to really involve the student in that. And I think that's just something that I don't want, I can't hit that or say that enough, that you have to involve the student in game design.
Awesome. So it's pretty obvious at Game Like Training, we're not just playing games. We're using constraints-led learning framework, teaching games for understanding framework, the challenge point framework to design specific tasks for specific individuals that will help the behaviors that they need to play better golf emerge. And this can be done from elite level players all the way down to your club golfer who only has 1 or 2 hours a week to practice. It can be made fun, it can be made addictive, and it can really help the players that you work with train to perform and ultimately transfer their range game to the golf course. Thanks, Eric.